Well, we all know that Latinos are growing as a percent of the American population. They're estimated now at about 16.7% of the national population there, but in states like Texas and California, they're up to 39.7% of the population, 36.7, 39.7, somewhere in there. A higher percent in New Mexico, but most significantly, they are growing as a percent in all states across the country, particularly in the South and in the Midwest. The big question is, well, is that going to translate into political power? Is that going to translate into political influence? And it's a slightly complicated question. Of course, it means that Latinos are going to have more influence than they've ever had before. With growing population comes growing numbers. But those numbers don't always reveal themselves in every election. It depends on levels of registration, and it particularly depends upon levels of mobilization by particular candidates. It also depends on one other factor that's even more significant than any of the others, and that's how competitive the election is in the state. Even if Latinos are just 10% of the voters, if the election's very close, that 10%, if 60% of that 10% vote the same way, can determine the election. But it's a little more complicated than that. Even that 20% that may vote Republican may be a critical margin for the Republicans, depending on how competitive the election is. So Latinos can be important for Democrats or for Republicans, but it depends on how competitive the election is and how other people vote. In a state like California, Latinos are very critical to the Democratic majority being consistent. It's the reason that Barbara Boxer won re-election in her recent re-election campaign. It's the reason that California, a traditionally Republican state, has been so consistently Democratic since 1994. Think of it this way. There's no presidential campaign that the Democrats envision that does not include winning California. That's the base. You start with winning California. Largest state in the country, largest number of electoral votes. It's a critical component, right? If the Democrats don't win California, they don't win. Why can the Democrats rely on California or think they have a really good chance in California? Because California is a state where Latinos, growing population, since the mid-1990s, more and more a percent of the electorate. Since the mid-1990s, more and more consistently Democrat. Latinos are that critical margin that give the Democrats the comfortable foundation upon which they build in other states. In New Mexico, Latinos are critical for both parties, Republicans and Democrats, depending. They vote majority Democrat, but those 30 to 40% who may vote Republican can be the margin for Republicans depending upon how white voters vote. But Latinos are very important. Nevada, increasingly important. The recent re-election of the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, he spent a lot of time and a lot of money catering to Latino voters and trying to receive their support. That was successful, critical margin. Why? Because Latinos are a growing percent of the population. Given how whites split their votes in the state, Latinos gave the Democrat that critical margin. In Colorado, similar story. The Latinos in a competitive election could be critical for the Democrats. Florida. In Florida, Latinos are critical to both Democrats and Republicans, because in Florida, Latinos, although the Cuban vote is majority Republican, Latinos, the more diverse group, splits the state, the Latino vote, sometimes 51-49 for the Democrats, sometimes 51-49 for the Republicans. It very much depends upon who the candidate is. Marco Rubio, who just won the U.S. Senate race there, received a larger percent of the Latino vote, overwhelming Cuban support, a large percent of the Latino vote. That was part of the reason that he could win, but he had a lot of support from white voters too because he was a social conservative. The bottom line is Latinos are important. Latinos are important in critical swing states. Latinos are going to grow in importance. Whether they're important in any particular election depends on the election. Depends on the candidates, depends on who's running.